Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and this is a conversation about variability in games. I'm going to try to stop clicking this before things get out of hand. This is a conversation about variability in games. What does it mean? What am I looking for? When is it a good thing, a bad thing? Why? Well, I mean, just all the aspects, really. And the reason I'm doing this is twofold. One, I like talking about board games in all shapes, sizes, and forms, and any sub-conversation, tangent, whatever it is, I like board games. Two, I do get questions on a frequent basis whenever I say a game isn't variable enough in a review, in a whatever kind of video I'm doing, then I talk about variability. I will frequently get questions asking what I'm looking for, or asking why I felt that game was variable, that game wasn't, and so combine those two, and here's a good excuse to talk about variability in board games. And before we dive into it, I want to start with something that a little meme I saw once in a board game group that I thought was very on point, because of people always demanding variability, myself included. It was a meme basically showing a picture of like chess in the background and saying, if I've learned one thing from modern board games, is that chess is a terrible game because it has no variability. Which I think is funny. Also, I don't play chess that often, so maybe that is relevant. But let's go ahead and dive into it, and we're going to come back to that meme later in the conversation. Starting off with, why is variability important? Why is it important to me? Why should it be important to anyone? And I think we have to take a step back into why you're playing games to begin with. I talked about this in a different video I did a while ago. I'll link that down below if I remember. But a video about, I can't remember the exact title, something along the lines of, does winning matter? Is winning important? And that kind of also dove into the, why are you playing games? What is the reason you play games? You see, if the goal of playing is mastery of a game, well then variability is actually a bad thing. We'll come back to more on the why, but it would be a bad thing. Variability would get in the way of mastery of an experience, because the variability is constantly adjusting that experience and giving you a different experience, and so it makes the pursuit of mastery take longer. Not that you can't achieve it, it would just take longer. Variability gets in the way of mastery. If you play games because your goal is winning games, well, see mastery. I mean, inherently, if your goal is winning a game, then mastering the game is a good step along that path. And so, again, if your goal purely is winning, I can make a strong argument that variability is actually a bad thing, or at the very least, not a good thing. But for me, the reason I play games, and I talked about this in that other video, and I'm going to talk about it here now as well, the reason I play games is because I want to play them. I want to experience them, I want to enjoy them, and to that end, mastery actually gets in the way of playing games. It gets in the way of having a bunch of people sit down at the table and play games, because as soon as mastery is in the picture, now it's a conversation about who's better, or is the goal winning, or you potentially mismatched against other opponents. If I've played the game 15 times and you've played the game 3 times, it might just not be a fun experience for you. I did another video even further back about mastery in board games and covered those same general concepts. To me, my goal is to play. And to that end, things that get in the way of mastery are actually a good thing, because it elongates how long it would take for my threshold of skill to far outpace another person's. And so if the goal is playing, I would argue that to one extent, which is the extent we're talking about here, variability is important because it makes mastery takes longer. It provides a fresh experience every time you dive into a game, and that fresh experience has a bunch of pros and cons, which we'll get to shortly. But one of those is the fact that it makes it take a lot longer for that skill gap to become evident amongst players. If I am playing the same experience every single time, then I have learned how to master that pathway. The narrower the path, the more I can figure out the mastery of the path. The wider the path, the more opportunities it might take for me to experience it. Think about it practically. If I have 3 routes I can take towards the end goal, well then I can figure out which one is optimal, or which combinations of crossing those paths are optimal in a shorter amount of time than if I have 17 different routes towards the end goal. Inherently, it takes more plays, more time, more opportunities, more experimentation before I can find that ideal pathway. And so mastery to me is a bad thing, playing games for fun is a good thing, therefore variability is a good thing. Secondly is, to me, and this is diving a step down, to me variability is important on, I would say, for 3 main aspects. The first is the one I just spent an entire section devoting to, which is the fact that I like that skill gap. I think of mastery as a bad thing. Variability increases the amount of time it takes towards mastery. The second is going to be directly related to that, although slightly different, which is I like the puzzle of board games. Regardless of whether I am seeking to play against others, playing a solo game, playing a cooperative game, I like the puzzle. To me, one of the things that I love about board games as a hobby in general is that aspect of being presented with a set of facts, a set of constructs, a set of different things going on at the table, and then trying to figure out the optimal pathway through those things. And once I figured out that pathway, it's less exciting to me. Again, this is related to mastery, although they're slightly different, because this would apply even in a solo experience, even in a cooperative experience. Even if it doesn't bridge the gap between myself and others, or further keep that gap, separate, I just enjoy the process of looking at a set of constraints and trying to figure out my way through it. One of the reasons I love Unsettled, or Vindication that came before it, is the fact that those games, both of those games from Orange Nebula, frequently provide a puzzle in front of me that is always different because of the degree of variability they bring to the table. Because they present you with a general construct, a general goal, and then within that goal, things are constantly changing. The way tiles come out, the way cards come out, the way powers come out, the way all these other facets are introduced to the game, you frequently have a new puzzle to dive into, a new set of constructs, of constraints. If I have this tile on the board here, and that tile here, and this tile here, and then I have these three companions, and that relic, and that ability over there, this is the best pathway forward. Each time is a different puzzle. When you're exploring Unsettled, every single planet box is its own little puzzle. Every single planet box comes with its own 3 goals. But then even within each goal, you can adjust the variability, you can adjust the difficulty of the experience, thus providing not so much variability but more of a challenge, but you can also just inherently rely on the fact that things will come out in different orders. The way the planets you're exploring reveal their cards, that will be different. The way you gather the various discoveries that you get throughout the course of the game, those will be different. The order, any number of different things, from the abilities you have, from the starting abilities your characters start with, everything is a different contribution to changing up the puzzle of the experience, ensuring that I look at each game with fresh eyes. That's going to be true of Spirit Island as well. The idea that every single time I dive into it, depending on the combination of spirits that I'm using, whether I'm playing it solo with other players, the combination of spirits on the table, the way the cards come out from the enemy deck, and the just sheer number of power cards you have in the game, they're all providing that same aspect, that different puzzle, that different way of looking at something, the different mindset as I dive into the experience. I like the freshness of a new puzzle. Trying to iterate upon the same puzzle, to me, starts getting boring over time. Over time, not like one play, but the more time it takes that you're starting to look at the same puzzle, and your pathways are narrowed, and you don't have as much opportunity to explore, the more I will get to a certain point where mastery, where I am starting to pursue a pathway of mastering the same set of criteria, as opposed to getting a full new set of criteria. And then the third aspect of why I like variability is it's fun. It's just fun to have different things. I like new cards, new characters, new powers, new goals, new buildings, new anything. I like the fact that a game will give me more stuff to explore. Not just from the stance of the strategy aspect of being given a separate set of criteria to go through, but hey, if you're playing Marvel Zombies and you have a character with their own set of 3 powers, and you have a different character with their own set of 3 powers, it's something new. New is exciting. New is fresh. You could watch the same movie again and again and again, and if it's good enough, it's worth watching. But you can also watch a new movie, and new movies often have their own merit just from the fact that they are new. This is true with any form of medium of entertainment you experience. There is something nice about the new. There's something fun about exploring something new, not just from the strategic perspective, which was point 2, but just from the sense of seeing and engaging with more things. And that's why I like variability. Those 3 core aspects. The fact that it contributes to a larger mastery gap between players, or minimizes the mastery gap, I should say. Because of the fact that there's more pathways, more things, more opportunities to explore, it means that it will take us a longer set of plays before the difference in our skill levels become evident just because I've played it more than you or not. Which is a good thing for me because it means I can play the game more. I've gotten rid of 3 games in my collection because of, over the 8 years over the 11 years I've been playing games, 10 years, I don't even know what number we're up to, 11 years. Over the 11 years I've been playing board games, I've gotten rid of 3 games because I hit a certain point where I was just beating everyone I played it with because I had played it more. And I'm happy it's only been 3, and part of that is because I specifically select games based on their variability, and so that gap takes a long time to achieve. Where are we from there? I had a next point. So, how much variability? That's where we are. How much variability is important? It depends on how often you play the game, ultimately. And this is where something I talked about with the Reckoners. I probably should have put that on the table. The Reckoners is a game that I found, the base game, before we got to the expansion, which I just covered. But the base game of the Reckoners is a good example of a game that I thought was a lot of fun, but felt mostly samey after 3 or 4 plays. It started to feel like I was playing the same game, that I had seen the concepts the game had to offer, and at that point I was just diving into the same experience. Sure, the epics came out in different orders, the characters you used were slightly different, the power cards, the way they came out, those were all slightly nuanced differences, but it felt like I was making the same basic pathway, trudging down the same pathway of a decision tree every single time after 3 or 4 plays. But it wasn't that big a deal to me, because the Reckoners is a game that I only pull out every 4 or 5 months, get a play in, and then put it back on the shelf, so I don't need that much variability. The mixing and matching of the various cards and the things that are going on in the game is enough for me if I'm playing the game every 4 or 5 months. But of course I made sure to note in my review, hey, just as a factor, there is a potential variability problem at the table here, so just factor that in as you go through it. And the expansion certainly helps with that. But that's a good example of a game where variability is not that important if you're not playing it that often. You might have some of the others at the table. Again, going through my 3 reasons why I like variability: more stuff, the gap in mastery, and just seeing a different puzzle every time. Well, the gap in mastery is not a problem for the Reckoners because it's a cooperative game. More stuff, there's enough honestly fun stuff that I still felt like I was getting that experience at the table. But then the aspect of exploring and seeing a new puzzle every single time, that was something that I was missing out on. Too much variability can potentially be a bad thing. It can overwhelm you with too many stuff, too many things you have to learn. Too Many Bones is a great example of a game that has a ton of variability, especially if you have all the content, all the characters. But all that stuff can also provide a barrier to entry, a barrier to learning the game. Too much content for a game can be its own problem, its own barrier to entry, but it's one that we can sort of bypass ourselves if we just pretend it doesn't exist. Not if you don't get it, you can get it or not, that's your choice. But for instance, Too Many Bones is a good example of a game where I have tons of stuff for it, but I only pick up a new character when I really feel like I've dove into the last few characters, because I don't want to have to relearn everything every single time. And because each character is its whole new explorative journey of trying to figure out the way they play, I find that I specifically gate and limit the content I experience. It can still be a bad thing. Too much stuff can overwhelm you and can just make it harder to table a game, but I would say in general, too much is something that you can, for the most part, self-modulate around. Versus not enough content for a game, not enough variabilities to experience, there's not a lot you can do with that. You either think the experience is still worthwhile, or you don't. That's a choice you have to make for yourself, but there's nothing you can really do. I mean, past making up your own fan-created content or changing the rules of the game, you're kind of just stuck with a minimum amount of content, if there is that minimum amount of content, minimum amount of variability. I think lastly, I want to dive into what constitutes variability. This kind of touches upon the first aspect I touched upon at the beginning, where one of those questions I frequently get when talking about variability is that aspect of, why did you feel this game was variable and this game wasn't? Or why do you love TAC so much? Why do you love TAC so much, but you don't love Merchants of the Dark Road? You called this one, I said Merchants of the Dark Road, one of my problems with it was it felt like the same game every time I played it. It felt like I was diving into mostly the same journey. Small nuances, small differences. There are different huts you can use as far as the things you put on the table, but they didn't change the experience that much, and so I mostly felt like I was playing the same game when I played Merchants of the Dark Road. A good game, but one that felt samey after multiple plays, versus TAC is much less in terms of the rules, in terms of the differences, but it's one that I have no complaints whatsoever around the nature of variability, which brings us to what constitutes variability, at least from the way I look at it. And it's basically 2 things. The first is what we've talked about already. More content in any shape or form. You know, if you have new buildings, if you're playing a game like Le Havre, like Ort Labor, like Merchants of the Dark Road, if you have new buildings, new locations that are mixed in game to game, and that shifts up, or you have Glass Road for another Uwe Rosenberg game that will have a ton of buildings that just shift out every single game, and so you never really get to fully explore everything, and the combinations of those powers, those abilities. You have characters, you have the Spirit Island with all its powers and abilities, you have Marvel United with every single character in the game, you have any number of different things here that are unsettled on all the planets, more content, more buildings, more endgame scoring, more goals, more challenges, more any single thing in the game is the first thing. Just more content. Although I should probably add a third thing, which is, because we haven't gotten the second one yet, but let's make it 1, 2, and 3. So more content in general is going to add variability. Number 2 is more rules. More rules, more expansions, similar to more content, but with not just like more of the same with variability of how it presents, but actual rules changes to the experience. That you'll have a full new thing, you know, an expansion for Seven Wonders. Suddenly you have leaders. Yes, it's more content, but it's also a change to the way the game is presented, making it a more variable experience every single time. So more content, more rules, more overhead, more stuff like that. And then the third one, and the important one, is player interaction. Player interaction and how it forces new game states is a huge part of variability. It's a huge part of why almost any single heavily interactive game in my collection will rarely get the complaint that it is not variable. because a lot of player interaction forces the game state to constantly be changing and forces the puzzle to constantly be evolving as you go through the game. TAC is a game that has a handful of rules. You iterate upon the game, you learn a few different game states, and you start diving into it, and then you're faced with a player sitting across the table from you. Remember my little meme thing from the beginning about chess? Chess doesn't have a problem with variability because the player you are playing against forces the game state to constantly be iterating. It forces the game state to constantly be adjusting. You are never fully presented with the exact same puzzle because you are faced against another player who is changing the board around you, who is forcing you to rethink, who is forcing you to repivot, the way they adjust their strategy, the way they dive into the game, the tactics they use, and the state of the board and the way they manipulate it provides an ever-evolving experience that is constantly keeping you on your toes. High interaction games, in my opinion, rarely suffer from a lack of variability. Although, caveat, to me variability is not about the pure nature of, is this the same thing? It's more about, do I feel I'm being presented with the same mental thought process? Is the game no longer providing a puzzle as I try to explore one thing or the other? And so again, high interaction games I find rarely devolve into me thinking that I'm going through the motions. Because the other player is constantly reacting, I'm frequently thinking through 4 or 5 turns ahead of how I'm going to do things, and that forces my mind, my approach to the game to never become stale or dull, or to become stale or dull far less frequently. When going through these games to pull on the table here, I tried finding a highly interactive game in my collection that I could critique from its stance of variability. And I'm sure they exist. I'm sure it does. I really couldn't find one. Heavily interactive games, almost on their own, provide their own interactivity and their own variability to experience. Blood Rage, Kemet, again, I picked one of the lowest amounts of rules in my collection here, and that still had a degree of variability. It still had enough things going on that I just felt it was not something that I would complain or critique as variability, because I always feel like I'm on my toes. That's a big one for me. The fact that other players and how they force you to approach or examine a game, whether they do or don't, make me start to feel like I'm just going through the same motions, whether I'm starting to border on the path of mastery as opposed to the path of exploration. Which is why, by the way, for context, Search for Planet X is over here because of that aspect. Search for Planet X is a game that gives you a variable challenge every single time. It's a game about trying to go through a deduction puzzle as you go through the process of trying to figure out where Planet X is. You have a set of rules, a set of criteria, you start diving into that, you're presented with information as you go through the game, and there are other players at the table. Now, this is one where I will have people who disagree with me on this. I know this because I reviewed the game, and I already had that, but I said that for me, and the way I've played the game, I feel that when I play Search for Planet X, the other players don't matter as much. So again, I'm giving the information to you that already. Other people don't necessarily agree with that, factor that in. But because of that, when I play Search for Planet X, as much as I do enjoy the game, and I think it's a great game, but as much as I do enjoy the game, I often find myself devolved into playing the same puzzle, going through the same mental process. The order the information is presented to me is different. The slight puzzle is different, but the rule set is the same, and so I feel like I'm going through the same sequence of challenges. I'm playing Sudoku. I'm going my own little, here's this number's here, that number's here, that eliminates here. I like the process of any logical puzzle, including Search for Planet X, including Sudoku, including any of these things, but it is a game that I feel doesn't have that amount of variability because the mental process I apply to the game feels the same every single time. Chess is highly variable. When I say a game in a review, going back to the review aspect, when I say a game in a review, when in a review I say a game isn't variable enough, it means that either or any of those factors weren't applied. There wasn't enough rules over... I'm clicking again. There wasn't enough rules overhead to make the game state constantly changing. There wasn't enough content in the game that forced me to re-examine whether the decisions I'm making are going to be different or are presented with a different puzzle every single time I dive into it, or there wasn't enough interaction to make me feel like the game I was playing was constantly keeping me on my toes. It doesn't mean the game's a bad thing at all. It just means that the sense of exploration wasn't there. That the game at its core and the experience it provided was drifting more into a pathway towards mastering the experience as opposed to a pathway of exploring and finding something new. Which is great. It's all well and good. It's just not what I look for when I'm sitting down to play board games. I am specifically looking for that pathway of exploration. I'm specifically looking for something new. I'm specifically looking for more content and more ways to approach the same. I want games to feel fresh. And when they don't, they're still amazing. And for other people, that might be exactly what you're looking for. I know people who crave that lack of content so that they can start exploring that pathway towards mastery. And that's one of the nice, fun things about board games. Every board game has their own target audience. Every mechanic has people who like it or don't. Every aspect of what makes a game great for one person might make it less great for another. For me, I like variability. And hopefully this gave enough framework or context that the next time someone says, "Why'd you like that game, Alex, and not this one? Why was this one variable and not that one?" Well, maybe I'll just link to this video instead. In any case, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Like I said, it's all board games. I just enjoy board games. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and I hope you have a good one.